Mad Monkton, Chapter 4. You were born, I believe, in our country, he said. Perhaps, therefore, you may have heard at some time of a curious old prophecy about our family, which is still preserved among the traditions of Wincot Abbey. I have heard of such a prophecy, I answered, but I never knew in what terms it was expressed. It professed to predict the extinction of your family, or something of that sort, did it not? No inquiries, he went on. I have traced back the prophecy to the time when it was first made. None of our family records tell us anything of its origin. Old servants and old tenants of ours remember to have heard it from their fathers and grandfathers. The monks, whom we succeeded in the abbey in Henry VIII's time, got knowledge of it in some way, for I myself discovered the rhymes, in which we know the prophecy to have been preserved from a very remote period, written on a blank leaf of one of the abbey's manuscripts. These are the verses, if verses they do deserve to be called. When in Wincot vault a place waits for one of Monkton's race, when that one forlorn shall lie, graveless under open sky, beggared of 6 feet of earth, though lord of acres from his birth, that shall be certain sign of the end of Monkton's line, dwindling ever faster, dwindling to the last left master, for mortal ken from light of day, Monkton's race shall pass away. The prediction seems almost vague enough to have been uttered by an ancient oracle, said I. Observe that he waited, after repeating the verses, as if expecting me to say something. Vague or not, it is being accomplished, he returned. I am now the last left master, the last of that elder line of our family at which the prediction points, and the corpse of Stephen Monkton is not in the vaults of Wincot Abbey. Wait before you exclaim against me. I have more to say about this. Long before the abbey was ours, when we lived in the ancient manor house near it, the very ruins of which have long since disappeared, the family burying-place was in the vault under the abbey chapel. Whether in those remote times the prediction against us was known and dreaded or not, this much is certain. Every one of the Monktons, whether living at the abbey or on a small estate in Scotland, was buried in that Wincot vault, no matter at what risk or at what sacrifice. In the fierce fighting days of the old time, the bodies of my ancestors who fell in foreign places were recovered and brought back to Wincot, though it often cost not a heavy ransom, but desperate bloodshed as well, to obtain them. This superstition, if you please to call it so, has never died out of the family from the time to the present day. For centuries, the succession of the dead in the vault of the abbey has been unbroken, absolutely unbroken, until now. The place mentioned in the prediction as waiting to be filled is Stephen Monkton's place. The voice that cries vainly to the earth for shelter is the spirit voice of the dead. As surely as if I saw it, I know that they have left him unburied on the ground where he fell. He stopped me before I could utter a word in reminiscence, but slowly rising to his feet and pointing in the same direction toward which his eyes had wandered a short time since. I can guess what you want to ask me, he exclaimed, sternly and loudly. You want to ask me how I can be mad enough to believe in a doggerel prophecy uttered in an age of superstition to awe the most ignorant of hearers. I answer, and at these words his voice sank suddenly to a whisper, I answer, because Stephen Monkton himself stands at this moment confirming me in my belief. Whether it was the awe and horror that looked out ghastly from his face as he confronted me, whether it was that I had never hitherto fairly believed in the reports about his madness, and that the conviction of the truth now forced itself upon me, on sudden, I know not. But I felt my blood curdling as he spoke, and I knew in my own heart, as I sat there speechless, that I dare not turn around and look where he was still pointing close at my side. I see there, he went on, in the same whispering voice, the figure of a dark-complexioned man, standing up with his head uncovered. One of his hands, still clutching a pistol, has fallen to his side. The other presses a bloody handkerchief over his mouth. The spasm of mortal agony convulses his features, but I know them for the features of a swarthy man who twice frightened me by taking me up in his arms when I was a child at Wincot Abbey. I asked the nurses at the time who that man was, and they told me it was my uncle, Stephen Monkton. Plainly, as if he stood here living, I see him now at your side, with the death glare in his great black eyes. And so have I ever seen him since the moment when he was shot, at home and abroad, waking or sleeping, day and night, We're always together wherever I go." His whispering tones sank into an almost inaudible murmuring as he pronounced these last words. From the direction and expression of his eyes, I suspected that he was speaking to the apparition. If I had beheld it myself at that moment, it would have been, I think, a less horrible sight to witness than to see him, as I saw him now, muttering inarticulately at vacancy. My own nerves were now more shaken than I could have thought possible by that what passed. A vague dread of being near him in this present mood came over me, and I moved back a step or two. He noticed that action instantly. "Don't go. Pray, pray don't go. Have I alarmed you? Don't you believe me? Do the lights make your eyes ache? I only ask you to sit in the glare of the candles, because I cannot bear to see the light that always shines from the phantom there at dusk, shining over you as you sat in the shadow. Please don't go. Don't leave me yet." There was no utter forlornness, no unspeakable misery in his face as he spoke these words, which gave me back my self-possession by the simple process of first moving me to pity. I resumed my chair, and said that I would stay with him as long as he wished. "Oh, thank you, 1,000 times. You are patience and kindness itself," he said, going back to his former place and resuming his former gentleness and manner. "Now that I have got over my first confession of the misery that follows me in secret wherever I go, I think I can tell you calmly all that remains to be told. You see, as I said, my Uncle Stephen," he turned away his head quickly and looked down at the table as the name passed his lips. "My Uncle Stephen came twice to Wincot while I was a child, and on both occasions frightened me dreadfully. He only took me up in his arms and spoke to me, very kindly, as I afterward heard, for him, but he terrified me none the less. Perhaps I was frightened at his great stature, his swarthy complexion, maybe his thick black hair and mustache, as other children might have been. Perhaps the mere sight of him had some strange influence on me, which I could not then understand, and cannot now explain. However it was, I used to dream of him long after he had gone away, and to fancy that he was stealing on me to catch me up in his arms whenever I was left in the dark. The servants who took care of me found this out, and used to threaten me with my Uncle Stephen whenever I was perverse and difficult to manage. As I grew up, I still retained my vague dread and slight abhorrence of our absent relative. I always listened intently, yet without knowing why, whenever his name was mentioned by my father or mother, listened with an unaccountable presentiment that something terrible had happened to him, or was about to happen to me. This feeling only changed when I was left alone in the abbey, and then it seemed to merge into the eager curiosity which had begun to grow on me, rather before that time, about the origin of the ancient prophecy, predicting the extinction of our race. Are you following me? Well, I follow you every word with the closest of attentions. Well, you must know, then, that I had first found out some fragments of the old rhyme, in which the prophecy occurs quoted as a curiosity in an antiquarian book in the library. On the page opposite this quotation had been posted a rude old woodcut, representing a dark-haired man, whose face was so strangely like what I remembered of my uncle, that the portrait absolutely startled me. When I first asked my father about this, it was then just before his death, he either knew, or pretended to know, nothing of it, and when I afterward mentioned the prediction, he fretfully changed the subject. It was just the same with our chaplain when I spoke to him. He said the portrait had been done centuries before my uncle was ever born, and called the prophecy doggerel and nonsense. I used to argue with him on the later point, asking why we Catholics, who believe that the gift of working miracles had never truly departed from certain favored persons, might not just well as believe that the gift of prophecy had never fully departed either. He would not dispute with me. He would only say that I must not waste time in thinking of such trifles, that I had more imagination than was good for me, and must suppress instead of exciting it. Such advice as this has only irritated my curiosity. I determined secretly to search through the oldest uninhabited plate of the abbey, and to try if I could not find out in my forgotten family records who that portrait was, and when the prophecy had been written or uttered. Did you ever pass a day alone in the long deserted chambers of my ancient house? Never. Such solitude as that is not at all to my taste. Ah, what a life it is when I began my search. I should like to live it all over again. Such tempting suspense, such strange discoveries, and such wild fancies, such enthralling terrors, all belonging to that life. Only thinking of breaking open the door of a room which no living soul had entered before you for nearly 100 years. Think of the first step forward into a region of airless, awful stillness, where the light falls faint and sickly, though closed windows and rotting curtains. Think of the ghostly creak of the old floor that cries out for you when treading on it. Step as softly as you will, think of arms, helmets, weird tapestries of bygone days that seem to be moving out from you from the walls as you first walk up to them in the dim light. Think of prying into great cabinets, iron-classed chests, not knowing what horrors or wonders may appear when you tear them open. Of poring over their contents till twilight stole on you and darkness grew terrible in that lonely place. Of trying to leave it and not being able to truly go, as if something held you, of wind wailing at you outside, of shadows darkening around you and closing you up in obscurity within. Only think of these things, and you may imagine the fascination of suspense and terror in such a life as mine as in those past days. I shrank from imagining that life. It was bad enough to see its results as I saw them before me now. Well, my search lasted months and months. Then it was suspended a little, then resumed. In whatever direction I pursued, it always found something to lure me on. Terrible confessions of some past crime, shocking proofs of secret wickedness that had been hidden securely from all eyes but mine, slowly came to light. Sometimes these discoveries were associated with particular parts of the Abbey, which have had a horrible interest of their own for me ever since. Sometimes with certain old portraits in the picture gallery, which I actually dreaded to look at after I had found out. There were periods when the result of this search of mine so horrified me that I determined to give it up entirely. But I never could preserve in my resolution the temptation to go on seemed at certain intervals to go too strong for me. And when I yielded to it again and again, at last I found the book that had belonged to the monks, while the whole of the prophecy written in the blank leaf. The first success encouraged me to get back further yet in the family records, and I discovered nothing hitherto of the identity of the mysterious portrait, but the same intuitive conviction which had assured me of its extraordinary resemblance to my Uncle Stephen seemed also to assure me that he must be more closely connected with the prophecy, and must know more of it now than any else. I had no means of holding any communication with him, no means of satisfying myself with this strange idea of mine, whether it was right or wrong, until the day when my doubts were settled forever by the same terrible proof which is now presented to me in this very room. He paused for a moment and looked at me intently and suspiciously, then asked if I believed all he had said to me so far. My instant reply in the affirmative seemed to satisfy his doubts, and he continued on. On a fine evening in February, I was standing alone in one of these deserted rooms, on the western turret of the Abbey. I was looking at the sunset, and just before the sun went down, I felt a sensation stealing over me, which is quite impossible to explain. I saw nothing, I heard nothing, and I knew nothing. This utter self-oblivion came suddenly. It was not fainting, for I did not fall to the ground, and I did not move an inch from my place. If such a thing could be, I should say it was the temporary separation of some soul and body without any death. But all description of my situation at that time is impossible. Call my state what you will, some trance or catalepsy, I know that I remained standing by the window, utterly unconscious, dead in mind and body, until the sun had set. And then I came to my senses again, and when I opened my eyes there was the apparition of Stephen Monkton standing opposite to me, faintly luminous, just as it stands opposite to me at this very moment by your side. Was this before the news of the duel reached England? I asked. 2 weeks before the news of it reached us at Wincott, and even when we heard of the duel we did not hear of the day of which it was fought. I only found that out when the document which you have read was published in the French newspaper. The date of that document, you will remember, is February 22nd, and it is stated that the duel was fought 2 days afterward. I wrote down in my pocket-book on the evening when I saw the phantom, a day and the month of which it first appeared to me. That was the 24th of February. He paused again, as if expecting me to say something. After the words he had just spoken, what could I say? What could I think? Even in the first horror of first seeing the apparition, he went on, the prophecy against our house came to mind, and with it the conviction that I beheld before me, in that spectral presence, the warning of my own doom. As soon as I recovered a little, I determined, nevertheless, to test the reality of what I saw, to find out whether I was the dupe of my own diseased fancy or not. I left the turret. The phantom left it with me. I made an excuse to have the drawing-room of the Abbey brilliantly lighted up, and the figure was still opposite me. I walked out in the park, and it was there in the clear starlight. I went away from the home. I traveled many miles to the seaside. Still the tall, dark man in his death agony was with me. After this I strove against the fatality no more. I returned to the Abbey, and tried to resign myself to misery. But this was not to me. I had a hope that this drearier to me than my own life. I had one treasure belonging to me that I shuddered at the prospect of losing, and when the phantom presence stood a warning obstacle between me and this one treasure, this dearest hope, then my misery grew heavier than I could bear. You must know that I am alluding to. You must have heard often that I was engaged to be married. Oh, yes, quite often. I have some acquaintance myself with Miss Delmise. Well, you never can know all that she has sacrificed for me. You never can imagine what I have felt for years and years. His voice started to tremble, and the tears came into his eyes. But I dare not trust myself to speak of that. The thought of old happy days in the Abbey almost breaks my heart now. Let me go back to the other subject. I must tell you that I kept the frightful vision which pursued me, at all times and in all places, a secret from everybody. I know the vile reports about my having inherited madness from my family, and fearing that an unfair advantage would be taken from my confession I might ever make. Though the phantom always stood opposite to me, and therefore always appeared either before or by the side of any person I spoke to, I soon schooled myself to hide from others that I was looking at it except on very rare occasions, and I have perhaps betrayed myself several times to you. But my self-possession availed me nothing with Ada. The day of my marriage was approaching. He stopped and shuddered, and I waited in silence till he controlled himself. Think, he went on, think of what I must have suffered to look at, always at that hideous vision whenever I looked on my betrothed wife. Think of my taking her hand, and seeming to take it through the figure of that apparition. Think of the calm angel face and the tortured spectre face, always being together whenever my eyes met hers. Think of this, and you will not wonder that I betrayed my secret to her. She eagerly entreated to know the worst, nay more, she insisted on knowing it, and at her bidding I told all, and then left her free to break our engagement. The thought of death was in my heart as I spoke those parting words, death by my own act if life still held out after our separation. She suspected that thought. Well, I'm quite sure she knew it, and never left me till her good influence had destroyed it forever. But for her I should not have been alive now. But for her I should never have attempted the project which has brought me here. Do you mean that it was Miss Mies suggesting that you come to Naples? I mean that she's the one who suggested the design which brought me to Naples. While I believe that the phantom had appeared to me as the fatal messenger of death, there was no comfort, there was only misery rather, in hearing her say that no power on earth should make her desert me, and that she should live for me and me alone, through every trial. But it was far different when we afterward reasoned together about the purpose which the apparition had come to fulfill. Far different when she showed me that its mission might be for good instead of evil, and that the warning it was sent to give might be to my profit instead of to my loss. At these words, the new idea which gave the new hope life to me came in an instant. I believed then what I believe now, that I have a supernatural warrant for my errand here, and that faith I live, whether I should die. She never ridiculed it, never scorned it as insanity. Mark what I say, the spirit that appeared to me in the Abbey, that has never left me since, that stands there now by your side, warns me to escape from the fatality which hangs over our race, and commands me, if I would avoid it, to bury the unburied dead. Mortal loves and mortal interests must bow to that awful bidding. The spectre presence will never leave me till I have sheltered the corpse that cries to the earth to cover it. I dare not return, and I dare not marry, till I have filled that place that is empty in Wincott Vault. His eyes flashed and dilated, and his voice deepened. A fanatic ecstasy shone in his expression as he uttered these words. Shocked and grieved as I was, I made no attempt to remonstrate or to reason with him. It would have been useless to have referred to any of the most commonplaces about optical delusions or diseased imaginations. Worse than useless to have attempted to account by natural causes for any of the extraordinary coincidences and events of which he had spoken. Briefly as he had referred to Miss Mies, he had said enough to show me that the only hope of the poor girl who loved him best, and had known him longest of anyone, was humouring his delusions to the last. How faithful she still clung to the belief that she could restore him. How resolutely was she sacrificing herself to his morbid fantasies, in the hope of a happy future that might never come. Little as I knew of Miss Mies, and mere thought of her situation, as I now reflected on it, this made me feel sick at heart. They call me Mad Monkton, he exclaimed, suddenly breaking the silence between us during the last minute. Here and in England everybody believes I am out of my sense, except Ada and you. She has been my salvation, and you will be my salvation too. Something told me that when I first met you walking in the Villa Peel, I struggled against the strong desire that was in me to trust my secret to you, but draw me unto you as you stood alone in the quiet room. Tell me more of the idea of yours about finding the place where the duel was fought. If I set out tomorrow to seek it for myself, where must I go to first? Where? He stopped. His strength was evidently becoming exhausted, and his mind was growing confused. What am I to do? I can't remember. You know everything. Will you not help me? My misery has made me unable to help myself. He stopped, murmured something about falling as if he went to the frontier alone, and spoke confusedly of delays that might be fatal, then tried to utter the name of Ada, but in pronouncing the first letter, his voice faltered, and, turning abruptly from me, he burst into tears. My pity for him got the better of my prudence at that moment, and without thinking of any responsibilities, I promised at once to do for him whatever he asked. The wild triumph in his expression as I started up and seized my hand showed me that I had better have been more cautious, but it was too late now, not to retract what I had said. The best thing to do was to try if I could not induce him to compose himself a little, and then go away and think coolly of the whole affair myself. Yes, he rejoined, in answer to the few words I had now spoken to try and calm him. Don't be afraid about me. After what you have said, I'll answer for my own coolness and composure under emergencies. I have been so long used to the apparition that I hardly fear its presence at all, except on rare occasions. Besides, I have here in this little packet of letters the medicine for every malady of the sick heart. These are Ada's letters. I read them to calm me whenever my misfortune seems to get the better of my endurance. I wanted that half hour to read them in tonight, before you came, to make myself fit to see you, and I shall go through them again after you are gone. So once more, don't be afraid about me. I know I shall succeed with your help, and Ada shall thank you as you deserve to be thanked when we get back to England. If you hear the fools at Naples talk about me being mad, don't trouble yourself to ever contradict them. The scandal is so contemptible that it must end by contradicting itself. I left him, promising to return early the next day. When I got back to my hotel, I felt that I had an idea of sleeping after all that I had seen and heard was out of the question. I lit my pipe, and sitting by the window, had refreshed my mind just then to look at the calm moonlight. I tried to think what it would be best to do. In the first place, any appeal to doctors or to Alfred's friends in England was out of the question. I could not persuade myself that his intellect was sufficiently disordered to justify me, under existing circumstances, in disclosing the secret which he had entrusted to my keeping. In the second place, all attempts on my part to induce him to abandon the idea of searching out his uncle's remains would be utterly useless after what I had incautiously said to him. Having settled these two conclusions, the only real great difficulty which remained to perplex me was whether I was justified in aiding him to execute his extraordinary purpose. Supposing that with my help we did find Mr. Monkton's body and took it back with him to England, was it right in me thus to lend myself to promoting the marriage which would most likely follow these events? A marriage which it might be the duty of every one to prevent at all hazards. This set me thinking about the extent of this madness, or, to speak more mildly and more correctly, of his delusion. Sane he certainly was on all subjects, nay, in all the narrative parts of what he said to me on this very evening, he had spoken quite clearly, connectedly, and as for the story of the apparition, other men, with intellects as clear as the intellects of their neighbours, had fancied themselves pursued by phantoms, and had even written about it in a high strain of philosophical speculation. It was plain that the real hallucination in the case now before me lay in Monkton's conviction of the truth of the old prophecy, and in his idea that the fancied apparition was some supernatural warning to him to evade its denunciations. It was equally clear that both delusions had been produced, in the first instance, by the lonely life he had lived, acting on a naturally exhibited temperament, which of this rendered further liable to moral disease by a hereditary taint of insanity. Was this curable? Well, Miss Amise, who knew him far better than I did, seemed by her conduct to think so. Had I any reason or right to determine offhand that she was mistaken? Supposing I refused to go to the frontier with him, he would then most certainly depart by himself, and commit all sorts of errors, and perhaps to meet with all sorts of accidents, while I, an idle man, with my time entirely at my own disposal, was stopping in Naples, and leaving him to his fate after I had suggested the plan of his expedition, and I had encouraged him to confide in me. In this way I kept turning the subject over and over again in my mind, being quite free, let me add, from looking at it in any other way than practical point of view. I firmly believed, as a derider of old ghost stories, that Alfred was deceiving himself into fancying that he had seen the apparition of his uncle before the news of Mr. Monkton's death ever reached England. and I was on this account, therefore, uninfluenced by the slightest infection of my unhappy friend's delusions, when I had first fairly decided to accompany him in his extraordinary search. Perhaps my harum-scarum fondness for excitement at this time biased me a little in forming my resolutions. But I must add, in common justice to myself, that I also acted from motives of real sympathy for Monkton, and from a sincere wish to allay, if I could, the anxiety of that poor girl who was still so faithfully waiting and hoping for him in far-away England. Certain arrangements preliminary to our departure, which I found myself obliged to make after a second interview with Alfred, betrayed the object of our journey to most of our Neapolitan friends. The astonishment of everybody was of course unbounded, and the nearly universal suspicion I must be mad in my way as Monkton himself showed itself pretty plainly in my presence. Some people actually tried to combat my resolution by telling me what a shameless profligate Stephen Monkton has been, as if I had a strong personal interest in hunting out his remains. Ridicule moved me as little as any argument of this sort. My mind was made up, and I was as obstinate then as I am now. In 2 days' time I had got everything ready, and had ordered the travelling carriage to the door some hours earlier than we had originally settled. We were jovially threatened with a parting cheer by all our English acquaintance, and I thought it desirable to avoid this on my friend's account, for he had been more excited, as it was, by the preparations for the journey, than I at all liked. Accordingly, soon after sunrise, without a soul in the street to stare at us, we privately left Naples. Nobody will wonder, I think, that I experienced some difficulty in realizing my own position, and I shrank instinctively from looking forward a single day into the future, when I now find myself starting, in the company with the mad Monkton, to hunt for the body of a dead duellist, all along the frontier line of the Roman states.